My name is Andre Vasconcelos. I have been a doctor for more than 20 years, and a large part of my career has been built inside intensive care units, an environment where every minute can be decisive and every decision can determine the fate of a life. Since the first years of medical school, I already felt that my path would be connected to those extreme moments in which medicine is put to the test before human fragility. At first, I believed that the answer to everything lay in protocols, lab tests and machines. After all, that's what I had learned during years of study, but as cases accumulated, I realized that medical practice is much more complex. There are situations where the numbers point in one direction, but what happens before our eyes doesn't fit any logical explanation. It is in this space between what science can measure and what it cannot comprehend that some of the most striking episodes of my life have taken place. Throughout my career, I have witnessed stories I will never forget. I have seen patients in critical condition recover unexpectedly, defying all statistics. I have also seen families preparing for farewells become witnesses to something that seemed impossible. These moments not only challenge our knowledge, but also teach us humility. No matter how much medicine advances, there will always be mysteries we cannot fully unravel. That is precisely why I decided to share some of these stories here, in this space. I want you, who are watching me, to know that beyond science, there is also the human and spiritual dimension involved in every case. It doesn't matter if you believe in miracles or prefer to call it coincidence. What I'm going to tell you are real stories, lived by me and by so many colleagues who face hospital life daily. Stories that made me rethink my profession, my faith, and even the limits of what we can call rational explanation. By opening this space, my wish is simple, that each narrative is not just a medical report, but also an opportunity for reflection. Because inside a hospital, we learn that life is unpredictable, fragile, and at the same time, incredibly resilient. And above all, we learn that hope is one of the most powerful medicines that exist. He fought for life, and science had already given up on him. But in that instant when everything seemed lost, something happened. Something that still makes me question the limits of medicine and believe that there is much more beyond what we can explain. Before beginning this story, I need to ask for your help. If you like this kind of real account, which mixes medicine, emotion, and hope, subscribe to the channel now and activate the bell. This is essential so you don't miss any content we'll be sharing here. In addition, I need at least 100 comments so that YouTube will deliver this video to more people. So write in the comments, "I believe in miracles." This simple phrase can make a difference, so more people come in contact with a story that can awaken faith and hope in the midst of pain. Now, let me take you to the beginning of this narrative. Imagine a cold hospital hallway in the middle of the night. The constant sound of heart monitors mixes with the discreet hum of mechanical ventilation equipment. It is the typical setting of an ICU, a place where each bed holds a silent battle between life and death. It was exactly in this environment that I met Marcos, the patient you will follow in this story. But before introducing him in detail, I want you to put yourself for a moment in the shoes of someone walking down that corridor. The feeling is that time there works differently. For some, each minute is an eternity, marked by the anguish of waiting. For us, professionals, it is a whirlwind of quick decisions where there is no room for mistakes. And even so, no matter how much experience we have, there are moments that surprise us and make it clear that we do not control everything. That night, when I was called to assess Marcos's condition, I already knew it would not be an ordinary case. The worried expression of the team, the tense looks of the nurses, and the heavy silence in the air revealed that we were facing something serious. Still, I could not imagine how much this story would mark not only the life of the patient and his family, but also my own view of the profession I chose. Marcos arrived to us in a critical condition, almost without the strength to fight. But as you will see, what seemed to be just another tragic outcome within the hospital routine turned into one of the most inexplicable moments I have ever witnessed. And that is what I want to share with you today. So, get ready. This is not just a hospital story. It is an account about hope, about the limits of science, and about how sometimes life finds a way to manifest itself even when all signs say otherwise. Marcos was 46 years old, an ordinary man, the kind you might see walking down the street, having coffee in a neighborhood bakery, or laughing with friends in a casual conversation. He worked as an electronics technician and was known among his colleagues for his dedication and for the meticulous way he solved problems. A natural perfectionist who always found solutions for the most complicated machine failures, but who, ironically, was now facing the greatest enigma of his own life, the collapse of his own body. He was not the type of person who frequented hospitals. On the contrary, he stayed far from doctors, believing that his natural resilience and a few basic precautions would be enough to keep him healthy. Married, father of 2 teenage daughters, Marcos was described by his wife Luciana as a man of few words, but with a generous heart. Someone who did not talk much about feelings, but who showed love in small gestures, in the way he prepared coffee in the morning, in the care he took to fix what broke at home, in the silent hug when he noticed that someone in the family needed support. That week, however, everything had changed. It started with a low fever, which he insisted on ignoring. "It must be just a cold," he told his wife, refusing to seek medical care. On the second day came chills, weakness, and a dry cough that seemed relentless. Even so, Marcos went to work, believing it would pass quickly. But the situation worsened rapidly. By the end of the third day, he could hardly get out of bed, struggling to breathe and showing clear signs that something more serious was happening. Worried, Luciana didn't hesitate. She called an ambulance and insisted that her husband be taken to the hospital. When he arrived, Marcos already showed signs of severe respiratory failure. His oxygen saturation was dangerously low, and his skin had started to take on a pale, bluish tone that revealed the gravity of the situation. For anyone accustomed to emergencies, just one look was enough to understand. He was at imminent risk of death. While the nurses prepared him, Luciana stayed in the waiting room, holding her daughters tightly. The fear in her eyes was the same I have seen hundreds of times in family members awaiting news. It is a look that mixes despair and hope, as if each minute were torture. Deep down, everyone knows that in situations like this, the line between life and death is much thinner than we imagine. It was in this context that I entered the story. When I received the emergency team's call to evaluate the patient, I didn't yet know his name, just a middle-aged man in critical, unstable condition, requiring immediate support. But when I reached the bed and saw that man gasping, fighting with all his strength to fill his lungs with air, I realized that this would not be just another case. There was an entire life at stake. The story of a father, a husband, a man who, until a few days before, had lived an ordinary routine and who now found himself facing an invisible enemy, leaving him on the edge of collapse. The hospital, with all its structure, technology, and protocols, was ready to receive him. But as I would learn in the following hours, not even knowledge and available resources are always enough to explain what is about to happen. When I arrived at Marcos's bedside, the scene was already one of maximum urgency. The monitors beeped irregularly, each signal indicating that we were witnessing a body in collapse. His oxygen saturation dangerously oscillated between 78% and 82%, far below the minimum required to sustain vital functions. He breathed with effort, each inhalation sounding like a battle against an invisible enemy. The nursing team had already provided high-concentration oxygen, but still his condition did not improve. His body trembled, not only from feverish chills, but also from the extreme effort to stay alive. Half-closed eyes, Cold sweat dripping from his forehead and an expression of exhaustion conveyed the dimension of the fight happening there. We quickly carried out the initial tests. The results showed a severe bilateral pneumonia already progressing to acute respiratory failure. It was as if Marcos's lungs had been taken over by a storm, leaving no space for air to circulate. The X-ray showed extensive patches, indicating that much of the lung tissue was compromised. It was time to act quickly. We decided on orotracheal intubation, an invasive procedure, but indispensable to ensure that oxygen could reach the lungs effectively. I remember Marcos's gaze seconds before sedation, a look filled with fear, but also surrender, as if he knew he was entrusting his life to unknown hands. This is always one of the hardest moments, both for the patient and for us doctors, because no matter how much we explain the procedure, deep down, everyone knows it is a fine line. Some wake up after intubation, others, unfortunately, do not. While the tube was being placed, Luciana waited outside. She didn't yet know how serious Marcos's condition was, but she could feel it. Families have this gift, this instinct. When I finally spoke to her, I realized there was no way to soften the truth too much. I told her that her husband was in critical condition, that we would need every available resource, and that even so, the prognosis was reserved. Tears rolled silently, and the embrace of her daughters was the only comfort she found in that moment. In the following hours, the crisis intensified. Despite mechanical ventilation, the parameters indicated that Marcos's lungs were not responding well to the support. He went into septic shock, a devastating reaction in which the body, while trying to fight the infection, ends up attacking itself. His blood pressure plummeted, requiring the use of vasoactive drugs to maintain circulation. Kidney function began to fail, and soon we had to consider dialysis. On the monitor, each sudden drop in the numbers felt like a punch to the stomach. The room filled with professionals, nurses, respiratory therapists, doctors from different specialties. Each one knew what to do, yet the condition continued to deteriorate. It was as if we were trying to hold back a dam about to burst with our bare hands. Medicine at that point had offered everything it had: powerful antibiotics, advanced ventilation, drugs to sustain the heart, support for vital organs. But nothing seemed enough. I looked at Marcos and silently asked myself if he would have the strength to resist. The sensation was that we were facing an inevitable outcome, and this is always the most painful part of our profession, when all efforts seem in vain and the patient begins to slip through the fingers of life. The conflict was not only clinical, but also human. The team was exhausted, but no one wanted to give up. The family outside prayed in silence, clinging to any sign of hope. And I, as a doctor, had to maintain serenity, even while feeling inside the weight of every number falling on the monitor. It was the point of greatest tension. Everything indicated we were about to lose Marcos, but it was precisely in this abyss, when science already seemed to have exhausted its tools, that something completely unexpected began to happen. The clock read 3:20 in the morning. The ICU was filled with that heavy silence, interrupted only by the intermittent alarms of the machines. Every second, the numbers on the monitor screamed a cruel truth. Marcos's body was failing before us. Blood pressure, even with high doses of vasoactive drugs, dropped. Alarmingly, oxygen saturation hovered at critical levels, incapable of sustaining life much longer. The heart, irregular, beat like a tired drum, at any moment ready to stop. I had witnessed this scenario countless times, and, to be honest, that night, everything pointed to the same outcome. The team was ready to begin resuscitation maneuvers. The crash cart had already been placed at the bedside. It would be a matter of minutes before the line on the monitor turned into a flat trace, and we all knew what that meant. But it was precisely at this point, when the inevitable seemed about to happen, that something unusual began to manifest. First, an almost imperceptible detail. The oxygen saturation, which had been plummeting like a falling elevator, stabilized for a few moments. We looked at each other, wondering if it was just a malfunction. I adjusted the cables, checked the connections, but there was no error. The number stayed there, steady, as if something had interrupted the free and fall. Then the cardiac tracing, once chaotic and irregular, began to reorganize. Slowly but consistently, the beats gained rhythm, as if the heart had found strength somewhere we do not know. The air in the room changed. Everyone present noticed it. It was as if a different energy had filled the environment, a force none of us could explain. The nurses, accustomed to extreme situations, exchanged glances in silence. Some frowned, others simply took a deep breath, incredulous. And then came the most enigmatic part. Marcos, sedated, unconscious, and on the verge of collapse, showed a slight movement, first in his hands, then in his lips. Small signs, too subtle to be mere reflexes. I have seen many patients in critical conditions, but there was something different there. It didn't seem like an involuntary act. It was as if, somehow, he was trying to say, "It's not over yet." At that moment, the feeling was that we were witnessing something that did not fit into medical protocols. It was not just the discrete improvement in numbers, it was a change in the very atmosphere, an electric tension in the air, as if the room had become the stage for something greater. And that's when I realized Marcos's story was about to take a turn none of us expected. What happened in the following hours not only changed the fate of that man, but also challenged everything I thought I knew about medicine. But I won't reveal anything yet. What came next was so surprising that even today, years later, I still find myself revisiting that night in my mind, trying to find an explanation. And perhaps, precisely because I cannot find one, this story remains so alive within me. What you need to know is that in that instant when science had already given up, Marcos gave his first sign that he was not ready to leave, a sign that would change everything. As we observed those unexpected signs in Marcos's body, a different silence filled the room. It was not the heavy silence from before, when everyone awaited the worst. It was a silence loaded with expectation, as if each of us knew something was happening and did not dare to interrupt. Science teaches us to seek rational explanations for everything, every value on the monitor, every physiological reaction, every bodily response must fit into some known mechanism. But before Marcos, this logic seemed insufficient. I had read about improbable cases, those that defy statistics and enter the list of medical miracles. However, seeing them unfold before your own eyes is something completely different. I remember fixing my gaze on his subtle movements, the slight contraction of the hand, the faint tremor of the lips, and feeling a shiver run down my spine. There was no way to be sure what it meant, but inside me arose a clear sensation. He was fighting, even unconscious, even under sedation, even with organs failing. Something inside Marcos insisted on staying present. And here I want to pause for you watching this. How many times have we heard about the strength of the mind, of faith, of the will to live? Medicine, despite all its advances, still cannot measure these factors precisely. There is no exam capable of quantifying hope. There is no MRI that shows someone's intimate decision not to give up. But deep down, we all know it exists. I have seen it happen countless times. And that night, before Marcos, I was seeing it again. I am not saying that the medications, the machines, and the care of the team were not fundamental. Of course they were. Without them, he would not have survived until that moment. But there was something more happening. Something that was not in our hands. Something that crossed the barrier of technique and touched directly on the mystery of life. While reflecting on this, I thought of Marcos's wife, Luciana, waiting outside. I knew that if I were to speak to her at that moment, I would have no answers to give. I could say he was reacting unexpectedly, that there were promising signs, but I could not explain why. And that is perhaps the hardest part of being a doctor, admitting that we do not always have all the answers. The team, still on alert, began to work with renewed energy. Every adjustment to the ventilator, every nursing care, every monitoring was now done with an extra dose of hope, because no matter how much we tried to stay rational, it was impossible not to feel that something extraordinary was happening. And deep down, I knew that was only the beginning. The night still held surprises. What seemed improbable had become possible, but would it be enough? The following hours were a true battlefield. Each number on the monitor seemed to carry the weight of a sentence. Marcos had surprised everyone by stabilizing signs that already pointed to the end, but that didn't mean we were out of danger. On the contrary, it was only the beginning of a new, even more delicate phase. The oxygen saturation, which before had been plummeting, started to hold at minimally acceptable levels. The heart, fragile and irregular, now showed a more consistent rhythm. But even with these signs, there was constant fluctuation, as if life itself were playing on the fine line between resisting and giving up. One moment he seemed to respond, the next he fell again. For any doctor, this kind of instability is agonizing. While we adjusted the ventilator settings, I kept remembering Luciana's expression in the waiting room. She didn't know what was happening, had no idea about the small victories that appeared each hour. All she knew was that her husband was fighting, and indeed that was the best word to define that moment, a fight. Not just against the infection, against organ failure, but against something beyond biology, an intimate struggle waged in a territory invisible to us. The nurses began to notice subtle details. When we briefly reduced the sedation, Marcos showed reactions we didn't expect. Discrete movements, preserved neurological signs that didn't match someone in such deep collapse. It was as if he were, in some way, trying to return, trying to reconnect with the world around him. But medicine is relentless. Along with the signs of improvement, new risks also appeared. Blood pressure fluctuated dangerously, requiring constant adjustments. Kidney function continued to fail, forcing us to start dialysis. Every decision felt like walking a tightrope over the abyss. And it was in this scenario of uncertainty that a remarkable episode occurred. During one of the following nights, while we monitored his signs, Marcos suffered a sudden drop in heart rate. The monitor blared a deafening alarm. We ran to intervene. The team positioned itself to begin resuscitation, but, almost inexplicably, before we could deliver the first electric shock, the heart regained rhythm on its own. It was quick, as if something had pushed that spark of life back into place. Our eyes met. It was impossible not to feel the mystery hanging over that bed. I had seen patients recover after intense resuscitation maneuvers, but never had I witnessed a collapsing heart return to rhythm so abruptly without direct intervention. This sequence of events shook me deeply. As a doctor, I needed to remain rational, focused on technical conduct, but as a human being, it was impossible not to reflect. What was happening with Marcos could not be explained only within the limits of physiology. It was as if something greater was sustaining him, even when all parameters insisted on bringing him down. And so, days went by. Each morning when I entered the ICU, the sensation was the same. Marcos was defying logic, stretching his struggle beyond what any statistic could predict. We still didn't know what the outcome would be. There were serious risks, possible sequelae, and the line between life and death remained thin. But one thing was certain: he was not willing to give up. And it was precisely in that context, when we already believed we had seen everything, that the most surprising turning point of this story happened. A turning point that not only changed Marcos's destiny, but also left a mark on all of us who witnessed it. Days of continuous tension followed. Marcos remained under intensive care, sustained by machines, medications, and a team that had already surpassed the limits of exhaustion. Each improvement seemed fragile. Each setback felt like returning to square one. It was like watching a tightrope being crossed slowly. with the void always lurking. But then, on the 7th day of hospitalization, something happened. I was in the ICU reviewing charts when I heard a different kind of commotion at the back. It wasn't emergency alarms nor desperate running. It was a discreet murmur, almost contained, as if no one wanted to believe what they were seeing. I approached Marcos's bed and saw his eyes half open, trying to adjust to the light. He was still connected to the ventilator, but there was a brightness there I didn't expect to find. It wasn't just a reflex or an involuntary movement. It was consciousness. It was presence. It was as if, after days in deep silence, Marcos was finally returning to the world of the living. We suspended part of the sedation to evaluate better. He responded, first with a blink in response to simple questions, then with subtle movements of the hands, as if trying to communicate. The team, incredulous, exchanged looks that needed no words. We knew that patients in such critical conditions, even when they survive, often take weeks to show clear neurological signs. But there he was, surprising everyone. The following days were an impressive climb. Hemodynamic support began to be reduced. Dialysis, once indispensable, now showed signs it could soon be discontinued. Each test brought results that defied our initial pessimism. It was like watching a body rebuild itself before our eyes. And yet, there was something beyond biology happening there. I saw it not only in the numbers, but in the atmosphere around the bed. The nurses who accompanied Marcos daily commented on the unusual strength they felt in that environment. Luciana, his wife, upon entering for visits, cried silently, but described a strange sensation. "Doctor, it feels like someone is here with us, taking care of him, beyond you." And I understood what she meant. It wasn't just the technique. It wasn't just the drugs. Something invisible was sustaining that man. When we were finally able to reduce ventilation and begin the extubation process, the scene was unforgettable. As we removed the tube, we expected only a fragile, hesitant breath. But Marcos inhaled deeply, as if reclaiming not just air, but life itself. His eyes opened fully, and a tear slid quietly down his face. At that moment, I realized he was back. Of course, this didn't mean the battle was over. Recovery would still be long, filled with risks and uncertainties. However, what we witnessed at that moment was the definitive turning point. The impossible had turned into reality before our very eyes, and the most impressive part was still to come, something that would not only confirm Marcos's survival, but also leave a deep mark on everyone who stood by him during that journey. Few scenes in my career have marked me as much as that morning when Marcos breathed on his own for the first time, after days of complete dependence on machines. The team, used to the emotional strain of the ICU, could not hold back their reactions. Nurses who rarely showed emotions allowed discreet smiles to escape. One of the nursing technicians, who had been present at every shift since his arrival, wiped away a tear while recording his vital signs. It was as if we were all witnessing something that went far beyond medical routine, but nothing compared to the moment when the family was allowed to enter. I remember Luciana walking through the ICU door with hesitant steps, her trembling hands holding onto her daughter's arms. She expected to find a motionless, fragile body, still trapped in the silence of the machines. But when she saw Marcos awake, with teary eyes and his chest rising on its own, she froze in the middle of the corridor. For a moment, she seemed unable to believe what she was seeing. The daughters ran to the bedside, and even though the protocols didn't allow hugs at that moment, they leaned as close as possible, holding their father's hands as if they would never let go again. Marcos, still weak, squeezed back. It was a simple gesture, but one heavy with meaning, a reunion between life and those who never stopped believing he would return. Luciana's tears filled the room. It wasn't the cry of despair, but of relief, of gratitude, of victory after days when death had seemed inevitable. Many families thanked the medical team in situations like this, but her words were different. Holding my hand, she said, "Doctor, I knew he would come back. I had no explanation, but I New, and that sentence stayed with me. Because indeed, there was no scientific explanation sufficient to justify such a rapid recovery, such consistent improvement in a condition that had already crossed critical limits. It was something that defied not only medicine, but also our understanding of what is possible. The news of Marcos's return spread through the ICU. Doctors from other units stopped by his bed, curious to see the patient who had surprised everyone. They whispered quietly, almost as if they were standing before a secret kept by the hospital itself. Some called it coincidence, others a rare response. But in everyone's eyes was the same doubt. Could there have been something greater at play? In the following days, the emotional impact was as strong as the clinical one. With every visit from his family, Marcos grew stronger. He still couldn't speak clearly, but his presence was already a miracle in itself. Hope, which had been extinguished, now spread throughout the ICU, inspiring not only his family, but also other patients and relatives who heard his story in the hallways. And for me, that was one of the most revealing moments, seeing how the recovery of a single man could transform an entire environment. Because this wasn't just an individual victory, it was a reminder to everyone, doctors, nurses, patients, and families, that life can surprise us when we least expect it. But as I said, this still wasn't the end. The outcome of this story held a detail that would change everything, and that to this day stays with me not only as a doctor, but as a human being. The days following Marcos's extubation were a mix of relief and constant vigilance. Each morning, when I entered the ICU and found him more alert, more connected to his family, I felt I was witnessing one of those cases that forever mark a doctor's memory. Marcos slowly regained his voice, still hoarse from the tube that had sustained his breathing. When he managed to whisper his first words, his wife Luciana cried as if it were the first time she had ever heard him speak. He didn't say anything extraordinary, he simply called her name and his daughter's names, but in that moment, those simple words sounded like a miracle. As days passed, his body regained functions we thought were lost. The kidneys, once dependent on dialysis, began to respond. The heart, which had threatened to stop, now beat firmly. And the lungs, so devastated by the infection, showed a capacity for recovery that contradicted everything we had predicted in the first exams. When we finally transferred him from the ICU to the ward, I remember the entire corridor discreetly applauding. It wasn't common for us to do that. After all, hospitals live between losses and victories daily. But in that case, everyone felt there was something special. Marcos wasn't just a patient recovering, he was the symbol that life can resist, even when science has given up. Before discharge, I spoke with him at length. I asked if he remembered anything from the period he had been sedated, unconscious, on the brink of death. Marcos was silent for a few seconds, then smiled wearily but serenely. "Doctor, I don't know how to explain, but I felt I wasn't alone. I knew I had to come back." That answer gave me chills. As a doctor, I could list all the resources we used, the antibiotics, the machines, the team's dedication. But deep down, I knew that didn't explain everything. There was something beyond, something that doesn't fit into reports or protocols, and that is precisely the reflection I want to leave you, who made it this far following this story. Science is powerful, but it is not absolute. There are forces we cannot measure, moments when life insists on manifesting itself even when all signs say the opposite. Call it miracle, faith, or mystery. The name doesn't matter. What matters is recognizing that there is something greater guiding us and at times surprising us. Stories like Marcos's remind us never to give up completely, even when the odds are cruel. They remind us that hope is a remedy as powerful as any other, and that the presence of family, love, and faith can be decisive in battles that seem lost. And before I end, I want to ask you for something. If this story touched your heart, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. This helps us continue sharing stories that unite science, emotion, and mystery. And please, don't leave without writing a comment. Write, "I believe in miracles." I want to see at least 100 comments, so YouTube will spread this message to more people who may need hope today. And of course, don't go yet. The next video is already available here on the channel, and in it, I will tell another story that will give you chills. A story that shows how sometimes the unexplainable happens right before our eyes. I'm sure you won't want to miss it, because in the end, medicine saves lives, but it is life itself that teaches us every day that the impossible can become reality.